Nobody wants this, Naomi Sutter whispered to no one at all, standing in the dust of a stage yard that smelled of axle grease and abandonment. 38 years old, and holding $8 in a knotted handkerchief that represented the whole of what remained to her name. Her husband's brother, Garrett Sutter, had produced a bill of sale bearing what he swore was his dead brother's signature, and with it he had claimed the relay station, the grazing land, and the small herd that had been Naomi's entire life for 15 years, leaving her with nothing but that handkerchief and the clothes on her back. So she walked into the town of Coyote Flats, Wyoming territory, where the old stage depot was being cleared out for good now that the railroad had come through. And there, among crates of harness buckles and broken lanterns nobody wanted, she paid $5 for a derelict Concord stagecoach so old and so ruined that the auctioneer nearly refused to take her money. She told herself it was foolishness, a widow's desperate grasp at something, anything, that could still be called hers. She did not know, not yet, that sewn into the false bottom of that coach's ruined seat was a goodbye 13 years overdue, one that would clear a dead man's name, comfort a woman who had spent her whole life waiting, and put right a theft that had shaped the fortunes of an entire town. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Sutter. If you have ever been told that what you're holding on to is worthless, tell us in the comments, because sometimes the thing everyone else has given up on is the only thing left telling the truth. Before we begin, if you enjoy powerful stories of forgotten people, hidden truths, and extraordinary moments from history that deserve to be remembered, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you stories that inspire, surprise, and remind us that sometimes the smallest discoveries change everything. Now, settle in as we uncover the remarkable story of Naomi Sutter. Naomi had grown up the daughter of a harness maker in a small Missouri River town, in a household where leather and thread were the family's whole living, and where her mother, a quiet, exacting woman named Ruth, had taught her from girlhood the particular, unglamorous discipline of good stitching. Ruth could look at a saddle or a seat cushion brought in for repair and tell, simply by running her fingers along a seam, whether it had been sewn once and never touched, or sewn once and quietly mended later by a different hand, using a different tension, a different rhythm of the awl. A stitch tells you who made it and when, Ruth used to say, turning a piece of harness over in the lamplight while Naomi watched, and a second stitch, laid over the first, tells you somebody had a reason to go back. Naomi had thought of this, as a child, as simply a trick of the trade, the kind of small expertise that let her mother charge a fair price and never be cheated by a customer claiming shoddy work was already there when they brought it in. It would be many years before she understood that her mother had given her something far larger than a trade, an instinct for noticing when something had been touched twice, when a story had a second layer stitched quietly beneath the first. She married at 23, traveling west with her new husband, Ezra Sutter, a broad, patient, slow-spoken man who had secured a contract to run a relay station for the Cutter and Vane overland stage line at a bend in the trail the company called Coyote Flats, a scattering of buildings that would, over the following years, grow into a proper town around the depot Ezra tended. The relay station work suited them both. Ezra had a gift with horses that bordered on the uncanny, gentling teams half-wild from the trail in a matter of days, while Naomi kept the station's books, mended harness for the drivers who came through exhausted and grateful, and became, over the years, something of an informal seamstress and confidant to half the drivers on the line. Men who would sit at her kitchen table over coffee and tell her things they told no one else, homesick things, worried things, the ordinary confessions of men who spent their lives moving between places and belonged fully to none of them. It was during these years that Naomi first heard the name Thomas Vane, though she never once met the man himself, for he had vanished from the stage line's history a full 3 years before she and Ezra arrived in Coyote Flats. Vane had been, the old drivers told her, half the reason the line existed at all. A founding partner alongside Josiah Cutter, a man remembered by those who'd known him as fair in his dealings and generous in a way that occasionally worried men who thought generosity and business made poor traveling companions. In the summer of 1861, so the story went, a strongbox belonging to the company had gone missing during a run through the Badlands. a substantial sum meant for the driver's relief fund the two partners had established for the widows and children of men killed on the trail, and Thomas Vane had disappeared the same week, never to be seen in Coyote Flats again. Josiah Cutter had told the story for years afterward with a weary, forgiving sorrow that somehow made him seem the more sympathetic man in the telling. His old partner, he said, had simply proven himself unworthy of the trust placed in him, and Cutter had shouldered the company's debts and continued the line alone, out of loyalty to the drivers Vane had abandoned. It was, Naomi thought when she first heard it, a sad story and nothing more, the kind of small scandal every town accumulates and eventually stops repeating. She had no reason, then, to doubt a word of it, and every reason to feel grateful to the Cutter family, whose contract kept food on her own table. What she carried forward from those years at the relay station, more than any specific skill, was a settled conviction, planted by her mother and confirmed by a decade of listening to tired men speak honestly over her kitchen table, that the story told loudest and most often by the person left standing is not always the truest one, and that patience, the same patience it took to run a stitch straight and even across a long seam, was usually rewarded, sooner or later, with the truth showing itself in some small, physical way that talk alone could never provide. She did not know, in those contented years, that this conviction would one day be the only tool left in her hands, or that it would be enough. The fall, when it came, arrived with the particular cruelty of loss compounding on loss. Ezra died in the spring of 1874. Thrown from a green gelding, he was gentling for a new relay contract, his neck broken in the fall, gone before Naomi could even reach him across the corral. She had scarcely begun to grieve when the railroad's advance crews reached the edge of the territory that same season, and everyone in Coyote Flats understood, with the particular dread of people watching their livelihood become obsolete in real time, that the stage line's days were numbered, that within a year or two the Great Iron Road would carry passengers and freight faster and cheaper than any coach ever could, and that relay stations like the one Ezra had tended would soon have no purpose at all. It was into this uncertainty that Garrett Sutter arrived, Ezra's younger brother, a man Naomi had met perhaps 4 times in 15 years of marriage and liked less with each visit, a man who had drifted from failed venture to failed venture across 2 territories while resenting, with an intensity he rarely bothered to disguise, that his steadier older brother had managed to build something lasting out of a life Garrett considered no better than his own. Within 6 weeks of the funeral, Garrett produced a document before the circuit judge, a bill of sale dated 4 years earlier, bearing what he swore was Ezra's signature, claiming that Ezra had sold him a controlling interest in the relay station's land and stock to cover a gambling debt Garrett alleged his brother had incurred on a trip to Cheyenne that Naomi had no memory of him ever taking. She knew, with the same certainty she'd once used to read a seam, that the document was false. Ezra had never gambled in his life, had never once traveled to Cheyenne without her, had never signed away land that was as much a part of him as his own hands. But a widow's certainty, she was learning, weighed nothing at all against a signature and a brother's confident testimony before a judge who had never met Ezra and had no particular reason to doubt Garrett's word. The judge, noting that the railroad's arrival made the whole matter somewhat moot in any case since the relay contract would likely lapse within the year regardless, ruled in Garrett's favor, and gave Naomi 30 days to vacate the only home she had known for 15 years. She spent those 30 days doing everything a woman in her position could think to do. She wrote to the Cutter Company's office asking whether the relay contract itself, at least, might be transferred to her directly rather than through Garrett, and received only a brief, unhelpful reply noting that such matters were handled at the company's discretion. She asked the drivers who still passed through, men who had eaten at her table and confided their troubles to her for a decade, whether any of them recalled Ezra ever mentioning a debt to his brother, and found sympathy in their faces but no useful memory. For Ezra had never spoken of such a thing to anyone because it had never happened. She searched every trunk and drawer in the house for some scrap of paper that might contradict Garrett's bill of sale, and found nothing because a forged document she was coming to understand in the same slow way her mother had once taught her to understand a seam, leaves no trace of the truth it replaced. On the 29th day, with nowhere else to go and a stage line dying around her anyway, she walked the short distance into the town proper, carrying what little she could in a single trunk, her mother's sewing tools, and $8 sewn into a handkerchief because she trusted her own pocket less than she trusted her own hem. She arrived in Coyote Flats proper on the very day the old stage depot was holding what the auctioneer called a clearing sale, the company having decided, with the railroad now only a season away from completion, that there was no further use in maintaining a second depot building or the retired equipment stored behind it. The yard was full of the sad detritus of a dying trade: broken harness, cracked wheel rims, a collection of oil lanterns nobody troubled to relight, and at the very back, half sunk into weeds, sat a single retired Concorde coach, its once fine red paint gone gray and peeling, one wheel cracked clean through, its leather thoroughbraces rotted to little more than fiber. A coach so plainly beyond any practical use that the auctioneer had listed it almost as an afterthought, expecting to give it away to whoever wanted the scrap iron. When the bidding, such as it was, opened and closed at $4 with no other interest, Naomi heard herself say $5, and a ripple of quiet amusement went through the handful of men gathered for the timber and tools being sold alongside it, because everyone present understood that a woman freshly evicted from her home had just spent more than half her worldly money on a coach fit for nothing but firewood. She had her reasons, even if she could not entirely have named them to anyone watching. It was, first and simply, shelter. A coach body, however ruined, could be pulled somewhat upright and slept in, which was more than her $8 could otherwise guarantee her for many nights running. But there was something else, too, something closer to her mother's old instinct, a faint and stubborn sense that a thing everyone in a hurry had decided was worthless might still be worth a slower look, and Naomi Sutter, standing in that dusty yard with nothing left to lose, had nothing but slow looks left to give. She had the coach hauled, with the last of her coins spent on a boy and his mule team, to a small patch of unclaimed ground at the edge of town near the creek, where she set about making it livable with the same patient competence she had once brought to mending harness. It was in the course of this work, 3 days after the purchase, stripping the ruined seat cushion to salvage what horsehair stuffing remained dry enough to use, that her fingers found something her eyes had missed entirely: a line of stitching along the underside of the seat's wooden base, tight and even and clearly newer than the surrounding upholstery, exactly the kind of second seam her mother had spent a childhood teaching her to notice. Somebody had gone back. Somebody had opened this seat once, for a reason, and closed it again with care. She worked the stitches loose with the point of her mother's own awl, her hands steady though her breath had gone shallow with a feeling she could not yet name, and beneath the seat's wooden base she found a shallow compartment, dry despite the coach's general ruin, holding a small oilcloth bundle tied with waxed twine. Inside it, when she finally worked the knot free in the fading afternoon light, was a leather-bound ledger and a single folded letter, its paper gone brittle and yellow but its ink still dark and legible, addressed, in a careful, sloping hand, to a name Naomi did not at first recognize: Miss Clara Whitfield, Coyote Flats. She sat on the creek bank for a long while before she allowed herself to open it, aware, in some instinctive way, that she was holding something that had waited a very long time for the right pair of hands, and that whatever it contained was not, strictly speaking, hers to read. But the ledger's cover bore a name she did recognize: Thomas Vane. And Naomi, who had spent a decade of kitchen table conversations absorbing the town's history along with its harness repairs, understood at once that she had found something considerably larger than she'd bargained for with her $5. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to like the video. It really helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to people who appreciate them. And while you're watching, tell us in the comments: have you ever found something that seemed worthless at first but turned out to be incredibly valuable? We'd love to read your story. The letter, when she finally read it, was written in the voice of a man who believed he was dying and had very little time left to say what needed saying. Thomas Vane wrote to Clara Whitfield with the plain, unadorned tenderness of a man who had loved her a long time and never once said so plainly enough, apologizing first and at length for vanishing from Coyote Flats 13 years earlier without a word of explanation, an absence he knew must have looked, to her and to everyone else, exactly like guilt. He had not stolen the strongbox, he wrote. He had discovered, in the weeks before it went missing, that his partner Josiah Cutter had been quietly diverting company funds meant for the driver's relief fund into private land purchases along the very route the stage line traveled. Land Cutter intended to sell at enormous profit once a rumored rail survey confirmed the route, using the company's own charitable fund as his private investment capital while the widows and orphans it was meant to protect went without. Vane wrote that when he confronted Cutter privately, Cutter had turned the accusation back on him with terrifying speed and confidence, and Vane, understanding that a partner with Cutter's standing in town would win any public accusation against a man with no proof but his own word, had done the only thing he could think to do. He had removed the fund's remaining silver himself, before Cutter could spend the rest of it, intending to hide it somewhere safe until he could gather proof of Cutter's dealings and clear his own name before returning it properly to the fund. He had hidden it, the letter specified with careful, deliberate clarity, beneath the flat capstone of the old dry well behind the original relay station house, the first one, before the newer station had been built. A well Naomi realized with a small jolt was the very one still standing, half-collapsed and disused, behind the house Garrett Sutter now occupied. Vane had planned to return within the season. He had fallen ill instead, badly enough that he doubted, by the time he wrote this letter from whatever distant town he had fled to, that he would live to make good on the promise. And so he had sewn his ledger and his confession into the seat of the coach he had once ridden the most, the coach the drivers all called the Vane coach long after he was gone, trusting that if it was ever properly opened again, by someone patient enough to notice the second stitching, the truth might finally reach the woman he had loved and never married, and the fund might finally reach the families it was always meant to help. Naomi sat by the creek until the light went entirely, holding 13 years of silence in her two hands, and thought of her mother's voice at the workbench. A second stitch tells you somebody had a reason to go back. Thomas Vane had gone back, in the only way left to him, sewing his goodbye into a seat cushion and trusting the years to eventually produce someone willing to look closely enough to find it. She did not act at once, for the ledger's contents, once she had gone through them fully over the following days, described a fraud far larger and more carefully documented than she had first understood. Years of shipping manifests and land purchase records in Vane's own hand, cross-referencing company funds against Cutter's private acquisitions with the same meticulous discipline Naomi recognized from her mother's harness ledgers. Building a case, she realized, that Vane had been assembling, for weeks before his disappearance, evidence he had never gotten the chance to present. And she understood, with a sinking clarity, that the Josiah Cutter of this ledger was not simply a private matter of old history, for his son, Bartholomew Cutter, now ran the very company whose contract had employed her husband, and Bartholomew's fortune, considerable and growing, was quite plainly built on land his father had purchased with money stolen from the driver's relief fund 13 years before. She sought out Clara Whitfield first, before anyone else, finding her exactly where the town's older residents told her she could be found. A spinster of some 60 years now, still keeping the small millinery shop she had run her whole adult life. A woman who had never married and whom the town had long ago stopped wondering about, assuming simply that Clara Whitfield had never found a man to suit her. Naomi delivered the letter in person, sitting across from her in the quiet back room of the shop, and watched 13 years of a question finally answer itself on an old woman's face. Not the anger Naomi had half expected, but something closer to relief. The particular relief of learning that a silence you had spent a lifetime privately blaming yourself for had never been about you at all. Clara wept, briefly and without embarrassment, and then asked, in a voice gone suddenly practical, what Naomi intended to do about the well. What Naomi intended, she realized as she said it aloud for the first time, was to finish what Thomas Vane had started, and to do it in a way that could not be quietly buried the way his own name had been. It did not take long for word to reach Bartholomew Cutter that the widow Sutter had been asking unusual questions about a coach nobody thought worth $5, and that Clara Whitfield had been seen crying in the company of a woman his family's contract had recently, if indirectly, put out of her home. Bartholomew Cutter was a smooth, prosperous man in his 40s who had inherited his father's business since along with Naomi now understood his father's talent for making an ugly thing sound entirely reasonable. and he called on her at the Creekside coach with an offer to purchase it back from her at a generous multiple of what she'd paid, citing sentimental value and the company's interest in preserving its old equipment now that the line was closing for good. Naomi, who had spent 15 years listening to tired drivers tell her the truth over coffee, recognized fear dressed up as sentiment when she heard it, and declined the offer with a courtesy that revealed nothing of what she already knew. The refusal changed Bartholomew's approach considerably. Within days, a rumor began moving through Coyote Flats that the widow Sutter had been discovered removing company property from the old depot yard without proper authorization, a rumor with just enough shape to trouble the sheriff, who came to ask her some careful questions about the coach's ownership. Separately, Garrett Sutter, who had every reason to want to stay in Bartholomew Cutter's good graces since his own claim to the relay land depended on the company's continued goodwill, began telling anyone who would listen that his brother's widow had always been given to strange fancies and ought not be encouraged in whatever nonsense she was currently pursuing about old company scandals. Naomi found herself, for a difficult stretch of weeks, exactly where a woman digging up an old truth so often finds herself, alone, doubted, and facing two men with far more standing in the town than she possessed, one of whom controlled the very well she needed to reach. But she had, after all, spent her whole life reading what a fraud tries to hide beneath its surface, and she understood that a ledger as detailed as Thomas Vane's did not need the town's immediate belief to be true, only enough patient corroboration that belief would eventually have nowhere else to go. She copied Vane's ledger entries by hand, matched them where she could against surviving company shipping records the depot clerk still kept in storage awaiting the final closure, and enlisted, at Clara Whitfield's quiet suggestion, a young circuit-riding newspaperman who had been passing through Coyote Flats writing a series on the stage line's final season. A man hungry enough for a real story that Bartholomew Cutter's discomfort mattered to him a great deal less than the truth did. Between the ledger, the surviving records, and Clara Whitfield's own willingness, finally, to speak publicly about the letter she had waited 13 years to receive, the newspaperman had, within a month, a story that could not be quietly dismissed as a widow's strange fancy. The well behind the old relay station, when a small gathering including the sheriff, the newspaperman, and a visibly unhappy Garrett Sutter finally pried up its flat capstone, yielded exactly what Thomas Vane's letter had promised, a strongbox, rusted but intact, holding silver coin that, once counted and compared against Vane's careful ledger, matched almost precisely the sum he had recorded as the funds balanced the week it disappeared. Bartholomew Cutter's protest that the discovery proved nothing but Vane's own guilt collapsed within days under the weight of the land records the newspaperman had by then also uncovered, showing Josiah Cutter's private purchases along the survey route, timed with damning precision against the fund's disappearance. Bartholomew did not go to prison, for the theft belonged to a dead man, and the law found itself uncertain, as it so often does, what to demand of a son grown wealthy on a father's old crimes. But the territorial stage authority, its interest sharpened considerably by public attention, required the company to restore the fund's original value with accumulated interest in Bartholomew. His reputation and his standing among the remaining drivers and townspeople sharply diminished, quietly. Relinquished the company's remaining assets in Coyote Flats rather than face further scrutiny into his father's dealings. Garrett Sutter's fortunes unraveled with a speed that struck the town as almost too neat to be coincidence, though Naomi took no direct hand in it beyond simply telling the truth wherever she was asked. The same newspaperman, digging into the Cutter family's history of convenient documents, took a professional interest in the bill of sale Garrett had used to claim his brother's land, and a handwriting examiner he consulted in Cheyenne found the signature considerably less convincing than the circuit judge had. Garrett left Coyote Flats before the matter could be formally reopened, and Naomi, though she never recovered the relay land itself since the railroad's arrival had by then made the whole question largely academic, found that watching her brother-in-law's fraud unravel under its own weight gave her a quieter satisfaction than any land ever could have. The restored fund, at Naomi's insistence and Clara Whitfield's enthusiastic support, was not simply distributed and forgotten, but used to establish, in the old depot building the railroad no longer needed, a modest way station and relief house for the drivers and station families the railroad's arrival had left without work or income. A place where a family suddenly without a livelihood could find a warm meal and temporary shelter while they found their footing in a territory changing faster than any of them had chosen. Clara Whitfield, restored at last to the story of a man she'd never stopped loving, spent her remaining years helping run it, and often told newcomers, with a small private smile, that the whole institution existed because a woman nobody expected anything from had paid $5 for a coach nobody wanted. And so it was that Naomi Sutter, 38 years old, cast out by a brother-in-law's forged claim and left with $8 and a coach fit for nothing but firewood, became the reason a town in the middle of losing its purpose to the railroad found, instead, one more purpose worth keeping. The coach that had sat rotting behind a dying depot, that every man in that yard had judged not worth a decent price, had carried inside it not silver alone, but a goodbye that had waited 13 years for someone patient enough to notice a second line of stitching where there should only have been one. Naomi had inherited her mother's gift for reading what a seam tries to hide, and it had cost her everything she owned before it finally gave back far more than money. A name cleared, a woman's decades of quiet grief finally answered, and a fund restored to the very purpose it had always been meant for. She had said, standing in that dusty yard with her last $5 in her hand, that nobody wanted this. It would turn out that everyone in Coyote Flats, in one way or another, had been waiting for it all along. We tell you Naomi's story not simply because an old coach and a hidden letter make for a satisfying discovery, though they certainly do, but because of what she chose to do once the discovery was hers alone to keep or share. She could have taken the silver quietly and said nothing of Thomas Vane's ledger at all, and given what had been taken from her, few would have blamed her for it. Instead, she spent her hard-won evidence putting right a stranger's 13-year-old wrong and building, from a dying stage line's last resources, a shelter for exactly the kind of family she herself had so recently been. That choice, more than the coach, more than the letter, more than the $5 that started it all, is the real inheritance of this story. The understanding that what the world discards in a hurry sometimes holds the one thing it was always looking for, waiting only for a patient enough pair of hands. Thank you for spending this time with Naomi and the coach that carried more than anyone knew. If her story stayed with you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs the reminder that quiet patience so often outlasts even the most confident lie, and we would love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real worth in something everyone else had already decided to throw away? We read every one, and we are always glad to have you with us. Until next time, stay close.